But the most recent report that I've been doing, I wanted to just turn to that because, you know, the Sater story has been done. We know it's out there. It still needs work. But, you know, the most interesting thing I've come up with lately is about our new Secretary of Commerce investing in a Russian-owned bank that's basically up to the minute involved in money laundering. And he's got, you know, 3 partners in that bank who are wealthy oligarchs, one of whom was a KGB agent appointed by Putin to the bank. This is the Bank of Cyprus. And at least 50% of that bank is Russian-owned. So Wilbur Ross is what the fellow we're talking about. We presented our report over the weekend. Several U.S. senators took the material there and asked Ross questions about all of his connections with these folks. But he never responded. And on Monday, the U.S. Senate voted 72 to 27 in his favor. I just find this outrageous, Amy. It's something that, you know, yet another case.
But talk more specifically about Wilbur Ross, again, the wealthiest, I believe, of the cabinet members. Your subtitle, "There's Still Time for Senators," well, this is before Wilbur Ross was confirmed, to examine Wilbur Ross and his mysterious Russian-controlled bank in Cyprus. Talk more specifically about this and the money he made and why this matters right now.
Well, he invested in this bank, which is the largest bank in Cyprus. It has a long, Cyprus is a big offshore haven, especially for Russians. Most of the direct investments that go into Russia are going through Cyprus. And his first partner in the bank, his co-vice chairman, was a guy who was a KGB agent appointed to that position by Putin because there were a lot of Russian shareholders in the bank after it went belly up. A second partner was the potash czar of Russia, worth about $8 billion, a guy named Rybolovlev. And Dmitry Rybolovlev not only sold Donald Trump bought Donald Trump's house in 2008 for $95 million in Palm Beach, but he was also tagged as bird dogging the president on the campaign trail, you know, intersecting with his landings in places like Charlotte, North Carolina, and Concord and Las Vegas, all over the campaign trail, and flying his Airbus 319 on these same routes. So what was he up to? Why was Rybolovlev, you know, intersecting with the president's campaign? You know, and the third partner was a fellow named Vekselberg, who is another big GARP, Russian investor. He has 4 companies in Switzerland. One of which has been implicated in intelligence spying for, you know, tapping people's internet connections. So, you know, this is kind of unacceptable. The final thing is that Wilbur Ross personally nominated as the CEO of this Bank of Cyprus, this Russian haven bank, the former head of Deutsche Bank, which is just, as David said, implicated in something like $10 billion of Russian money laundering. And Joseph Ackerman was there for 10 years. All of this happened on his watch. His reward is to become head of the Wilbur Ross-run Bank of Cyprus.
So, he was fined $650 million for helping launder Russian money through Deutsche Bank offices in Moscow, New York, and Cyprus. Deutsche Bank, as you point out, is Trump's largest known lender, having extended him more than $300 million of loans that remain outstanding.
Berlin's International Magic Festival. For decades, the world's best illusionists gathered here to entertain audiences with their magic. Now there's a new breed of magicians.
Can you see?
Their trademark trick, moving money. Not just a few coins, but billions of dollars. Back in 2011, Deutsche's Russian clients began short-selling stocks in the US through subsidiaries while buying the same shares in Russia, moving money out of the country, bypassing sanctions and taxes.
It's couched around being a failure against money laundering, but when you look at the wider ruling, it's much more around sort of failures in management and failures in internal systems and procedures.
Now the secret is out, and regulators in the UK and the US are fining Deustche hundreds of millions of dollars for unacceptable failure to stop money laundering.
It seems to be just another on the long list of practices which the bank has undertaken, which has left a very bad taste in people's mouth and resulted in a long list of quite sizable fines, of course not quite the size of the recent one agreed with the US Department of Justice, but it's still a very sizable fine. You don't see for now any signs that these cases are drying up.
Did Deutsche Bank miss the trick, or was it part of it? The US Department of Justice is carrying out a criminal investigation to find out. Mubin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, we are joined by TRT World's editor-at-large, Craig Capitas, who is in Paris as ever. Craig, this kind of sleight of hand is being described as a mirror trade. Tell us more about that.
Welcome to the sharing economy, Deutsche Bank style. Schnitzel, anyone? This is beautiful. It's real simple. You buy stock in Moscow in rubles, and then you call up your broker at Deutsche Bank in London, and you say, you sell them back at the same price you bought them from, and you launder the money out of the country. It's a shuck and jive trick. And you know, whoever said that the stock market is gambling simply never had a brokerage account at Deutsche Bank. This is remarkable, made all the more remarkable that the people who caught them here was the state of New York along with the British financial authorities.
Okay. Let's say you are a thief. You've stolen a bunch of money. Or maybe you're a crook and you have obtained a bunch of money through illegal means, through drug dealing or fraud or prostitution or something. Or, you know, let's be very discreet about it. Let's say you have somehow amassed a large amount of money and you just don't want to talk about where it came from. In any of these hypothetical circumstances, I want you to imagine, though, that you're not some podunk, thief, crook, shady bastard. You're big time. So you've got these ill-gotten gains, and it's not like a briefcase full of money. We're talking millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars that you have amassed through, let's not talk about it, means. If you want to ever be able to actually use that money and enjoy that money, you can't move it around just in, like, you know, bags full of loot. Once you're talking about millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars, there aren't enough briefcases and duffel bags in the world for you to move that kind of money around easily. And if you want to buy big rich guy stuff, if you want to buy, like, you know, a private island or a fleet of Ferraris or something, if you show up to pay with hay bales full of $20 bills, somebody's going to notice that. Somebody's going to start asking questions. And if you decide to deposit all your money in a bank, they're going to want to know where that came from in most banks, under most laws, in most countries. So if you've made lots and lots and lots of money in some shady way, you need something to do with that money that makes the money look sort of legit, just so you can use it. And we often think of that process of making illegal or shady or secret money look legitimate. We often think of that as like a mob thing, right? Like an organized crime thing, money laundering. But money laundering can also be a bank thing if you know the right kind of bank to go to. A couple of weeks ago, the big German bank Deutsche Bank, they got fined $630 million for money laundering. Apparently, Deutsche Bank moved roughly $10 billion out of Russia and disguised the source of those funds, made it all look legit. It was all tied to some big Russian stock fraud scheme or something. But it's funny, some of the accounts that were involved in that $10 billion money laundering scheme, some of those accounts were personally held by relatives of Vladimir Putin and by some of Vladimir Putin's closest and oldest friends. And when this money laundering scheme, including their accounts, was exposed at Deutsche Bank, Russian authorities, the Russian central bank, decided they needed to look into this. They were very concerned about this scheme to siphon money out of Russia without anybody knowing where it came from. The Russian central bank looked into the scheme and they decided to fine Deutsche Bank $5,000. Let me mention again here that the fraud here, the money laundering scheme here, was $10 billion. But that's how much the Russian central bank levied against them as a fine. Luckily, though, this was not just a Russia thing. This scheme did involve a Deutsche Bank office, yes, in Moscow, but also in New York, and interestingly, also in Cyprus. Stick a pin in that for a second. We will come back to Cyprus. Because of the New York connection, this giant multi-billion-dollar money laundering scheme ended up in the crosshairs of the Obama Justice Department. And yeah, when the Russians looked into it, they may have decided to only fine Deutsche Bank $5,000. When Loretta Lynch and the Obama Justice Department looked into it, they ended up fining Deutsche Bank $630 million. Needless to say, they took it slightly more seriously than the Russians did. For the people at the top when these things happen, though, it always seems to be sort of a soft landing, doesn't it? I said the offices involved in this Russian money laundering scheme were in Moscow and New York and Cyprus. When the last chairman of Deutsche Bank needed a new job after Deutsche Bank, where he landed was, very softly, as the chairman of the Bank of Cyprus. And Cyprus is a lovely place and a lovely part of the world, has a lot going for it. But in global finance, Cyprus is basically the locking black briefcase into which Russian oligarchs stuffed their ill-gotten gains before they handcuffed that briefcase to a henchman somewhere. This is where Russian oligarchs launder their money. And so Deutsche Bank takes part in this huge scam to launder Russian money, to basically smuggle billions of dollars out of Russia through its offices in Moscow and New York and Cyprus. The bank chairman from Deutsche Bank then personally lands at a bank in Cyprus. He was appointed chairman of that bank by its two largest shareholders. One of the two largest shareholders of that Bank of Cyprus is a close personal friend and business associate of Russian President Vladimir Putin. One of the other major investors in that bank, this is where it gets good, is a Russian oligarch who they call the King of Fertilizer. I know some of my critics call me the Queen of Fertilizer, but they mean it differently. But the King of Fertilizer guy, that is where the news comes home tonight. For Americans who are trying to make sense of our new president and this new government that he's putting in place, and what really explains their behavior when other political norms don't seem to. Because the King of Fertilizer is just an amazing story. He's not the richest person in Russia. That would probably be Vladimir Putin. But he does hold the title for what is believed to be the most expensive divorce in modern history. As part of his divorce proceedings, at one point, a Swiss bank awarded his wife $4.5 billion as her divorce settlement. Wow. You know, and a couple's divorce would usually be a private matter, especially one involving people we don't know from other countries. Why do we care? The reason it turns out we all have to care about it, the reason we all have to know about it now, is because it's becoming part of what we need to understand about our current American presidency. The split up of this couple reportedly started in 2007, 2008, thereabouts. The divorce settlement, in the end, wasn't finalized until 2015. But it was very, very lurid. The 7-year, 8-year period of that divorce, it was in the papers all the time. It was international news, had all these tabloid aspects to it. At one point, she accused him of having orgies on his yacht with young girls, and he accused her of stealing jewelry. He, in fact, had her arrested as a jewel thief at some point. Mostly what they fought about, though, was dividing their money. She thought that she was entitled to a multi-billion-dollar settlement in the divorce, and, this is important, she accused him of hiding his money so she couldn't get access to it. She accused him specifically of, quote, secreting and transferring assets in order to avoid his obligations. She basically said in order to keep her from getting her hands on what she believed was his money, he started putting his money in places she couldn't get to it. He started putting his money in very large chunks, in the largest chunks he could, into trusts in foreign countries, trusts that own stuff or held assets, anything to get his money off his balance sheet. But it also creates, if you think about it, this incredible opportunity for anybody who's in a position to sell something really, really, really expensive. Because this guy's motivation is not to get a good deal on any of these things, right? This guy is trying to park as much of his Russian money somewhere else. As much of his money as he can, he needs it tied up in real estate and these big assets in other countries. The bigger the deal, the bigger the price tag, the better. I mean, you want to be the guy who owns the Greek private island when the king of fertilizer starts looking for islands to buy to shelter his money from his wife, right? You want to be the real estate broker in New York City who's looking to sell the single most expensive private apartment in New York City when that guy comes around looking to spend as much money as he possibly can. The more money, the better. I mean, for the right kind of person, for the right kind of seller, this guy, the king of fertilizer, Dmitry Ryabov, he's just a walking cash register if you have the right kind of thing to sell him. Behold, La Maison de l'Amitié. My only thing worse than my Russian pronunciation is my French pronunciation. But La Maison de l'Amitié, it means house of friendship, house of amity. Remember the Amityville horror? The House of Amity, this house, was built in 2001 by a zillionaire, American zillionaire, who moved from New England down to Palm Beach, Florida, but then, sadly, he promptly went bankrupt. While he was still Richie Rich, before he went bankrupt, he did build this astounding house. It is tens of thousands of square feet. It has 22 bathrooms. Think about that. 22 people can go all at the same time. Although, watch out if they all flush at the same time. Kaboom! This zillionaire guy built this incredibly gaudy, gigantic mansion in Palm Beach, Florida in 2001. By 2004, it had been seized by the bankruptcy court, and he and his wife were on their way to facing tax evasion charges. But this house was put up on auction in conjunction with the bankruptcy in 2004. The person who bought the house on auction is now President Donald Trump. He bought it for $40 million. And then that big house in Palm Beach, it sat empty for 2 years. And it became sort of this local legend in Palm Beach real estate because the house was thought of as, locally, it was thought of as kind of a monstrosity. It was frequently described as gauche, as rococo. It had like fake art everywhere, you know, art inspired by real painters, which is sort of copies of stuff painted on the walls. Parts of the interior of the house were cobblestone, which nobody could quite explain. It also reportedly had a terrible mold problem. But Donald Trump bought it for $40 million in 2006. It sat empty for 2 years. And then in 2008, along comes Dmitry Ryabov, the king of fertilizer, right? Going through the mother of all divorces, needing the biggest ticket items you could possibly imagine as ways to shelter his money from his darn wife. The bigger the price tag, the better. I'm buying Greek islands. I'm buying the most expensive apartments in New York City. I need places to put my money. And Dmitry Ryabov turns around in 2008 and pays Donald Trump $100 million for that house. 2.5 times what Trump had bought it for 2 years earlier. Why did this guy spend $100 million on that property? I don't know. We do know that he never moved in. In fact, some reporting on the sale indicates that he never once set foot in it, and it's now being torn down. Trump and Ryabov have commented publicly that they never dealt with each other directly throughout the whole period of that sale. They never met. They only worked through intermediaries, which is interesting for a financial transaction that big, right? That was the single highest price paid for a single American house at the time of that transaction. That record actually may still hold. That may be the single most expensive house transaction ever in the United States. They never met? They only went through intermediaries? Who were the intermediaries? Well, the king of fertilizer, Dmitry Ryabov, who basically popped $60 million neatly into Donald Trump's pocket in this transaction. He doesn't have much of an American profile, but he does have one very important American connection. Remember I said that he's one of the major shareholders in that Bank of Cyprus? The chairman of that bank, as I said, is the former chairman of Deustche Bank, which just paid a $630 million fine for laundering illegal Russian money. He was installed as chairman at the Bank of Cyprus by the two vice chairmen of that bank. One of the vice chairmen of that bank is, as I mentioned, Vladimir Putin's close associate. But the other vice chairman of that bank is an American. The American is, in fact, the single largest shareholder in that bank. That bank that includes the guy whose firm was just done for the Russian money laundering and Vladimir Putin's very close associate. I should tell you, the vice chairman who that guy replaced was not only also a close Vladimir Putin associate, he was a guy who Putin was in the KGB with before he became Vladimir Putin. This bank is also owned in part by the Russian king of fertilizer, who did this inexplicable deal that Donald Trump miraculously stumbled into, that netted him $60 million for doing basically nothing. There is one American who is in the middle of that bank, who is the single largest shareholder in that bank. There's one American in that bank. And tonight, that American was just confirmed as our nation's new Secretary of Commerce. His name is Wilbur Ross. He's an American businessman, longtime friend of Donald Trump. Not much experience in international banking, but inexplicably ended up the majority shareholder in a Cypriot bank with all sorts of ties to Vladimir Putin and to a Russian oligarch who somehow, through some intermediary, we don't know who, ended up stuffing $60 million into Donald Trump's wallet, paying him $100 million for something that Trump had just bought for $40 million, and that the oligarch apparently had no personal interest in whatsoever. He never even bothered living in it and maybe never even visited. But Trump and that oligarch, no questions asked. They never met. No connection whatsoever, except through Wilbur Ross, Donald Trump's old friend, who will be sworn into the cabinet tomorrow as Commerce Secretary. And there's basically two things to know about this story going forward. One, in terms of explaining this presidency. The other one in terms of what happens next in our politics. In terms of explaining this presidency, you should know that at the time this magical deal emerged out of nowhere that put tens of millions of dollars in Donald Trump's pocket, at that time, Donald Trump was financially having a very difficult time. It is a matter of public record that he was fighting very hard, among other things, to avoid paying off a big loan that he had with Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank needs the money. That means Trump needs the money. That means Trump needs to get the money. So this mysterious windfall infusion of cash from the Russian guy came at just the right time for now President Trump. That may not end up being a political blessing to this administration, because now Wilbur Ross, with all of his unexplained, mysterious Russia ties, now he is a cabinet secretary. Now he's Secretary of Commerce. And any scandal that ends up affixing to him on this subject will affix to the administration throughout the time that he is in office. And the big problem with Wilbur Ross is that the scandal about him and Russia may ultimately be a scandal about Donald Trump and Russia. And we're going to be joined tonight by David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, who has just bylined a mega story on Trump and Putin. Among the news that Remnick has turned up is this. You remember that 35-page dossier with all those salacious details supposedly about Donald Trump? That unconfirmed dossier of dirt that Russians supposedly had on Trump? Well, here's The New Yorker. Quote, the 35-page dossier included claims about Trump's behavior during a 2013 trip to Moscow. The dossier concluded that Russia had personal and financial material on Trump that could be used as blackmail. It said that the Russians had been cultivating, supporting, and assisting Trump for years. According to current and former government officials, prurient details in the dossier generated skepticism among some members of the intelligence community. But in the weeks that followed, they confirmed some of his less explosive claims relating to conversations with foreign nationals. One intelligence official tells the New York Times, quote, they are continuing to chase down stuff from the dossier, and at its core, a lot of it is bearing out. And now here's what is shooting up right now like a flare in the night sky. Quote, some officials believe that one reason the Russians compiled information on Trump during his 2013 trip was that he was meeting with Russian oligarchs who might be stashing money abroad. And that, according to some officials, is why Russia was compiling dirt on Trump. Because he was helping them find places to put their money. Wilbur Ross was confirmed as Commerce Secretary.